I'm Tod Machover. That part I think I've got. And maybe composer and inventor, MIT Media Lab. I definitely think that in my case, I come from a very close family, and my parents, they've really had a strong influence on my growing up, and especially with what I ended up doing. It's actually kind of weird, I think sometimes. But they're very different in a lot of ways, and I think for some reason it's been very important to me to find out how to bring those cultures together. They actually still to this day get along extremely well, but they're so different. So my mom grew up in upstate New York, kind of European intellectual environment. She studied piano her whole growing up. She's really good, went to Juilliard. And so she was a terrific pianist, and around the time I was born, she decided not to concertize, but to teach. And she's a very energetic, creative person, so she really, I think, developed a very personal style of teaching, both excellent piano teaching, but always cared a great deal about encouraging all of her students to make their own music and to learn theory in really inventive ways. I know when I was a little kid, we used to have a big plastic staff that filled the whole living room that had a bass clef and a treble clef, and you'd throw a bean bag on these things and either sing the note or jump to the note. It was all fun. And she also had us do things like, I remember at the end of a piano lesson, I was sort of her guinea pig because I'm the oldest of 3 kids, and she'd say, okay, lesson's over. There'd be 3 or 4 of us around, and she'd say, I'll give you 10 minutes to go through the house, and everybody bring back some object that makes an interesting sound, and anything you want to. So we'd run around and bring back a book or a pot or a lamp or whatever. And then we'd sit down and she'd say, okay, what sound does that one make? Sound is, oh, that's interesting, that one, great. What's the loudest sound you can make with that? Oh, what's the softest sound? Oh, that's interesting. Okay, what does it sound like if you play those 2 at the same time? Oh, that's interesting. If you were going to give a word to describe that sound, what would you say? Oh, peaceful. Oh, great. Well, okay, great. So now we've got these sounds, these words. How can we tell a story with these? Oh, great. Okay, we want to start with that. Terrific. And so we'd make up a little story, and then somebody, you know, who would go first, second, and what the story was, and then you'd play this thing. And then she'd say, okay, and so for next week, when you're home, see if you can make a picture of what we did, so when you come back next week, we can try it again. And, you know, in that little bit of time, so many important things were there. First of all, the fact that music wasn't just something that a bunch of dead people had written on published music books that you had to learn. It was something that you could make yourself. It wasn't just a particular system of music that was in those notes. Music existed in the world around you, and it's people who take that and put it into a system. That was incredibly important. You could make music with other people. And then the business of drawing a picture, what it basically said is notation, which is such a barrier for so many people, learning to read and write the notes. Notation's nothing more than a way of remembering what you did so that you can do it again and maybe interpret it differently, vary it. So really powerful. So I think growing up with that training and her kind of open mind about music was important. My dad, I mean, he's not tone deaf, but I mean, he's not a musician at all. Didn't grow up with music, but is an incredibly visual person. So he grew up in the Midwest, incredibly different background. As kind of intellectual as my mom's background was, kind of high culture. My mom, I don't think she'd heard a single piece of pop music before she went to Juilliard. I mean, literally, I mean, she just didn't listen to that. My dad grew up in a very popular culture environment. He probably didn't hear a piece of symphonic music until he met my mom. And he was a cartoonist, so visually oriented, but really always made caricatures of people and was quite good. And studied engineering, and very early on, he had this idea that computers were going to be big, but the only way that they'd really be useful to people is if you could interact with them in the most natural way. And I think partly the field of graphics was just starting, but especially because he was a visual person, his idea of intuitive was, show me a picture, show me something on the screen that I can manipulate. And before the late 50s, it was all punch cards. I mean, you didn't have anything to look at that showed you, I mean, you couldn't make a picture, let alone have a picture showing you anything about your data or information. So he was involved with one of the very first companies in the New York area, making graphic displays. And I have a really different feeling about that. I didn't, certainly until I was a teenager, I found his office intriguing and really kind of strange. I mean, it didn't feel very natural. It was kind of in a big old industrial building. You'd go up in a kind of slightly creaky elevator, and there was all kinds of electronic test equipment and people building things. And I mean, the thing that was really attractive there were they had some of the first displays, and at that point you had light pens, these pretty fragile metal things. They were always tethered with a wire to the rest of the device. But gosh, you'd see these luminescent line drawings, and there were some of the early games, and you could change a face, and you had text on the screen, and it was really exciting. And it's funny. I mean, it's not like technology now where it's in all of our consciousness, and you just know that Apple's going to come out any day with something really interesting, and it's going to be better than what just happened. I mean, this stuff back then wasn't obvious that it was going to go anywhere. I mean, the academia and the military were using these things, but I didn't really have any particular sense that this was the future and oh my gosh. But it was very, very interesting to see these things develop from the very beginning and see the components over here and the first tests over here, and they it was a business, so it wasn't academia. They were selling these things, so they had to work as well as they could work at that point. So I think that was quite interesting, and I think in general the idea of this very organic, intellectual, artistic, musical culture and the populist, visual, technological, kind of industrial culture. My mom, who was actually, I don't know if elitist is the right word, but knew the very best performances and knew the artists that she thought were the most interesting, including contemporary ones. I mean, because of both their interests, we listened to a lot of John Cage and Morton Subotnick and European electronic music. And then I was just interested in how different these cultures were and how I was sort of drawn to both of them. So it was quite a lively household, I think. We went to a lot more really interesting, edgy art events, whether it was just, seeing Pablo Casals play the cello, or there was a movement in the New York area in the 1960s called EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology. Bell Lab technicians and artists in the New York scene. My dad was very involved in that, so we'd go to a gallery show with, really wild, I remember one was something where there were mice in a cage and a little robot that was building towers with blocks, and the mice were knocking it down, and the robot arm would put them back up. And this was very early, and why would somebody do that? It was quite interesting, and I think we were in the middle of interesting events more often than I'm able to drag my teenage girls to interesting events. So it was very interesting growing up, I think. Yeah, well, I never, my mom went to Juilliard, and I never had in my mind to go to Juilliard. I'd studied piano first, then switched over to cello when I was about 7. Played mostly chamber and solo classical music. Got really involved in rock music when I was a teenager, wired up my cello. And when I was done with high school, I knew that music was really important to me, and I knew I didn't want to be a cellist, but I wasn't really sure, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a composer or think about me. I was just interested in the ideas behind music. I was interested in mathematics. And and the last thing I thought about was going to Juilliard. I also, I had grown up and gone to high school in New York, so I wanted to get out of the East Coast. I went to University of California at Santa Cruz for a year, which turned out to be a really vibrant, a very intensive intellectual atmosphere where you could do a lot of aspects of music without it being a conservatory. And that's why I went there. You could study, there was a very good guy doing computer music. There was a performing ensemble that did a lot of John Cage and European avant-garde composers. There was a guy who had been at University of Chicago who kind of retired to Santa Cruz, who was one of the great music historians, music theorists, and I used to go to his house. I got him to tutor me on Beethoven piano sonatas, so there was nobody giving a course, and it was a wonderful place. But I had a lot more music training than most people there, so after a year I thought, gee, I don't really need college anymore, which wasn't correct, but that's what I thought. And I definitely, within a month or so of getting to Santa Cruz, I realized that composing was what I wanted to do, that my mind loved to put things together, and it combined all the different things I really loved. And I started getting even more interested in technology than I was in high school. So I moved to Italy for a year because one of my former cello teachers was playing in the orchestra in Florence. So that was really nice. I moved there, played in the orchestra for a year, studied with a very famous Italian composer named Luigi Dalla Piccola. And then, quickly at the end of that year, I knew that I probably should study something. I probably wasn't done with, I didn't know anything, but probably should go back and study composition. I knew I was a composer. And Pierre Boulez, who at that point was conductor of the New York Philharmonic, great conductor and composer, who's kind of my hero, came to Florence with the BBC Symphony. And I chased him down the block after the concert, and I think he thought I was going to mug him or something. And finally turned around. I said, I'm a young composer. I'd love to show you my music. Could we talk? So he invited me the next day to rehearsal, and we talked and showed him what I was doing. He was very, very nice. And I said, would you teach me? And he said, I just don't teach. I never have. I don't teach composing. I don't teach conducting. I just don't do that. I'm happy to stay in touch and follow what you're doing, but I can't teach. So I said, well, where's the best place to go? And he said, the only place the only good thing right now is to go to Juilliard and study with Elliott Carter. So that's what I did. But except it was like the end of the summer, and it was. But I went back. I convinced them to let me take the exam, and got in for that September. So I did start at Juilliard. I was kind of halfway through my bachelor's. I stayed there for my bachelor's, my master's, and started my doctorate, first year of the doctorate. And then the same Pierre Boulez had in between been invited back to France. The Pompidou Center opened up, and they started this big music technology institute. And Boulez invited me to go there, so I went for a year, stayed for 7, and never went back. But Juilliard, is this going to be on the air? No, I got to. It's funny. Music is, I guess it's true with a lot of disciplines, but just to get the skill you need to practice the art, to get your way around an instrument, to be able to imagine complex music in your mind so that you can think about it, shape it, write it down. Be able to, if you're a composer, hear your music played and be able to immediately have judgment about whether it's the way you want it or not, and then articulate. I mean, many, many skills that are not really intellectual skills. They're more like, you have to train your mind and your ears, but they're almost more like athletic skills than it's. So part of music, you just have to learn those things or you can't practice the art. On the other hand, one of my interests in music has always been what it means, why it affects us the way it does. One of the big mysteries of music is you take music without words, It means something to us because we know it's about something. It's about something important humanly, but since there are no words, nobody knows what it's about. Is it about a person? Is it about that person? Is it about some kind of story that you could put into words? So there's just an incredibly rich and interesting relationship between our listening to music and the way our minds engage. I mention that because you can't do any of that at Juilliard. So a place like Juilliard is terrific for, I got to study with Elliott Carter. So this amazing, probably the greatest living composer in my view right now. But he was never a pedagogue. I mean, I was one of his very few students. And the lessons, I studied with him for like 6 years. And I'd go into a lesson, there's a piano there. But as I remember it, for 6 years, we never actually lifted the lid of the piano. So the piano lid was closed, put the music on the piano. And as I remember it, every lesson we'd stand up. I don't know why, we'd never sit at the piano. And we'd look at the music and start talking about it. And, you would never kind of plunk out your piece. And, this is what, here's how it sounds. You'd never come in with a cassette or a CD. The understanding was that you imagined it in your head and you could look at it and talk about it, and both of you were hearing it as if there were a CD playing, but it was totally silent. And he would just, it's almost as if he was looking at his music. He'd look at it and say, oh, gee, okay, I see where it's going here. But it makes that sound here, but you could do it this way, or you could do it that way. And if you did it like that, it would keep somebody interested for over here, or this feels too obvious that you might do. And so it was completely unpedagogical, because he wasn't telling me a principle, he wasn't telling me a theory, he wasn't saying here's a way to think about it. He was just thinking about it out loud as if it were his music, pretty much. And so I had to kind of learn how to ask him questions, especially about harmony and texture. So it was a very unusual pedagogical experience. It was a wonderful way to train listening ability, inner listening, but most of the other courses were not so interesting, and it was not a very intellectual environment. So I took a lot of courses. I signed up for the general studies at Columbia while I was there. I think now Juilliard and Columbia actually have some reciprocal programs, but then it was like just doing another, just in my spare time. So that's where I took music theory and actually computer science, and I studied German, and all these things that I wanted to learn. I took some mathematics there. So it was kind of like 2 degrees. And Juilliard is, the great thing about it is that there's a incredible, really high level of talent. I mean, a lot of people there who are just very good at what they do and have been doing it for a long time. A lot of people there had decided way younger than I did that they wanted to be musicians. I think part of the bad thing is that skill is emphasized so much that a lot of people, by the time they get to Juilliard, I think they kind of forget why they got into music in the first place. And, if they're performers, this is a simplification, but a lot of them are trying to win a competition and play more accurately or better or more beautifully, whatever can be measured than somebody else. And, even for composers, it's to kind of win a prize or make a mark. It's not really, what do I really care about? And what's, I mean, the only reason anybody would ever want to be a composer is because there's something so burning inside you that you need to express and think about and figure out. I mean, it's such an impractical profession that, in general, composers are very sympathetic because they're dealing with real issues, and most of the practical things in life are kind of difficult. But at Juilliard, it tended to be almost like a business school. So, I learned a lot there, and I still have some friends there, but it wasn't my favorite environment. Yeah, I took, let's see, I don't actually remember the first song I ever composed. I think probably the first, we did a lot of these creative activities growing up. I think that I laugh because, My mom is also, I mean, she's on the one hand an incredibly creative pedagogue and is very good at drawing people out to, she's also a pretty strong personality. So I'm thinking that probably the first piece I ever composed is probably when she told me to, she said, oh, you should write a piano piece. Are you writing your piano piece? Or something like that, maybe. So there's probably some piece maybe when I was in middle school that I can't remember now. I did take composition lessons when I was in high school. So I wrote, piano pieces. I wrote some chamber music. I don't think any of that was particularly interesting. I don't remember too much of it. I did have, I went to Fieldston here in New York, so quite an interesting creative school. And I actually have more close friends who've stayed friends from Fieldston than I do from Juilliard, as a matter of fact. There were a lot of like-minded spirits. And one of my friends there was a very good writer. He's now a big screenwriter in Hollywood and a terrific musician. So the two of us had a kind of two-man music group, and we'd I put headphones, there was no such thing as an amplified cello at that point. So I took headphones, turned my cello on its side, kind of like a gigantic bass, and put headphones on clamped them around the belly of the cello so they were like a microphone. They amplified the cello. And he played guitar or keyboard, and we wrote a lot of songs together. So the first songs that I really were actually kind of pop songs that we did together. And we had tape recorders at home, and I used to go into the studio and record multiple tracks or change the quality of sound, things like that. And then, the first music that I remember really investing in that I composed was kind of the second I got to college, to University of California at Santa Cruz. And they started out being for kind of a music history course or a music theory course or a composition course, so not really where you'd expect to do anything interesting. But I think the bug of writing music had just been growing in me, and that was the right environment for me to say, oh my gosh, this is me. I've got a million ideas, and I want to have people play these pieces, and they're things I want to think about in terms of structure or how I want people to listen. And so I wrote quite a bit that first year at Santa Cruz, and then just kind of kept going. Yeah, so the way I listen to music goes in waves, depending on a lot of things, kind of how busy I am, if I'm in between composition projects, if I'm starting a new project. So the only time usually I listen to the radio for music is with my daughters when I'm driving them to school or driving them somewhere. And it's always, I think they'd kill me if I put the radio onto a station that I wanted to listen to. So it's always one of their stations. So I listen to a lot of, they're 15 and 12. I must say, just in this last year, their taste has it has changed from, really vanilla top 40, either totally pop or hip hop. They're kind of two kinds of stations these days. And but now they listen to a lot more kind of indie music, and so I listen to a lot of just music that teenagers are listening to because I'm around them. And then I exercise. I do rowing on a rowing machine in my, we live on a farm right near Boston, and I have a big barn that we converted to my music studio. So I go there early in the morning, and the first thing I do is rowing, and that's when I listen to a lot of music. So I row for about 45 minutes every morning, and put on my iPod, and it's a huge range. That's when I listen to either things that I just love and know very well and just want to pay attention to. It's also where I listen to things that are new that I want to get to know, and things that are new might be new recordings of traditional repertoire by people who I really like. And there's a pianist named Pierre who I've known for years, who's a specialist in contemporary music, but also has been recording a lot of Bach. And every time he comes out with something new, I'll listen to that very carefully. I listen to new music by composers who are interesting to me. I listen to some some, I don't know if I want to call it pop, but some interesting artists who catch my attention I listen to in the mornings. But strangely, the thing I listen to 75% of the time when I, am exercising with my headphones on, is English Elizabethan music, or Tudor Elizabethan music. So music from like about 1450 to the early 1600s. And I mean, and this is music that's attracted me for years, ever since I was probably in high school. And I love Bach, I love Beethoven, I love Mozart, I love the Beatles, I love Stockhausen, and I love many things. But for some reason, I come back to Elizabethan music because a little bit like the Beatles, it has, and I don't think it's an accident that it's English. England has had a lot of really bad periods of music, but it's had several amazing periods where they've found an incredible balance, not just between music that's rather complex and also pretty direct, like the Beatles. I mean, everybody likes it because the tunes are memorable, and I mean, any Beatles song is perfect. It gets to you right away. But if you look at the orchestration and the way the voices blend and the way the instruments are used, and if you listen carefully to subsidiary voices which are not the main bass line or the main harmony, it's very, very, I mean, I don't know if complex is the word, but it's very rich, much more than most pop music. So it's managed to combine complexity and simplicity in a very special way. And I think it took influences from all around the world. England's a little isolated, so when it clicks, and Tudor and Elizabethan music's like that. It's extremely calming. I mean, it always takes me to another place. It's also very, very stable and simple at the same time. There are these melodic lines that do the craziest things, much more interesting than what people were doing in other countries. And it's also harmonic. The English learned, in my view, how to use harmony much earlier than the French or the Italians or the Germans. So you have these crazy lines colliding against each other, whether it's string music or vocal music. And at the same time, these beautiful chord progressions that are, very modern in a lot of ways. So I just keep discovering new music from that period. New recordings, or somebody will discover at some castle, a trove of music that nobody ever played before. And for some reason, I listen to that a lot. I almost never these days sit down with a CD or my laptop and kind of just listen to a piece with a score. I probably would do that while I'm exercising. I love silence, and one of the paradoxes about the way I live and also about my work is that definitely one of the reasons that I went into music, and especially into composing, is that I love setting up an environment where I can be by myself for long periods of time and have everything as quiet as possible, either to think about sound, or to think about ideas, or just to focus on things that are important to me. So I do that. The barn where I work, I mean, it's only 15 minutes or so from Harvard Square, so it's very close to the center of Boston, but it happens to be a total oasis. It's completely quiet in there. You'd think you were out in, I don't know, the forest somewhere. And then at the same time, I work at MIT, which is, at this lab, which is the center of high technology and new ideas, and there are people all over the place, and it's a very beautiful building actually, but it's it's quite intense, and there are always people who want to talk to you about something, and so I kind of go back and forth. But one of the things I like most of all is being in my study, in my barn, with absolutely no sound anywhere, thinking about something. Yeah, it's extremely important to me. So in a funny way, Hyperinstruments, I keep talking about the Beatles, and I think, maybe it's because Sgt. Pepper's came out when I was about 13 or 14, and it was a pretty impressionable age, and things, it was such a kind of radical period. But that period of the Beatles really had a big influence on me, and I think are directly related to Hyperinstruments. So here, an album like Sgt. Pepper's comes out, incredibly new sounds, layer upon layer of studio-produced sound like nothing anybody had ever done before. And it's also the period where the Beatles realized that what they were making in the studio could never be performed. And they'd already been getting tired. They'd already kind of given up on performing because there were too many screaming fans, and they were playing in larger and larger venues, so they couldn't even hear what they were playing. It just wasn't fun anymore. At the same time, their music evolved to something that they could only put together in a multi-track recording studio. So I think so many things about that period in the late 60s stuck with me. The sense of, I mean, I love the cello. I love this physical sense of an instrument that's about the size of your body, that vibrates enough so that even if you play an open string, you know, you feel it. I mean, you really feel it from your toes to your, you know, hair follicles, and you know, it really uses your. I mean, you have to put a fair amount of effort into the instruments. I mean, I think a double bass for me would be like too much effort, but the cello, you know, you're really engaged, and the sound is kind of right here, so it feels like being merged, married to an instrument. I like that feeling, and I like the idea of imagining a sound and feeling a sound and then having it come out through your body through an instrument like that. So that's an important way to make music. Then you have something like the Beatles making this great music where they say, you know, we just give up. We can't, we're never going to perform this. It's not just that we're not going to go on tour right now. This music has too many layers. It's got, you know, too many changes in the sound. You know, this voice is getting, all of a sudden gets prominent and then it disappears, and this is its final version. You also have at exactly the same years. I never thought of that, but 1967, Glenn Gould, the great pianist, wrote an article called "The Future of Recording," and that was exactly the period where Glenn Gould said, "I'm never going to play in public anymore. You know, I don't." First of all, I'm kind of shy, and I don't like, it just makes me uncomfortable to play in front of people. Plus, I want to get my performances exactly right. You know, I imagine precisely the way these different lines in the Bach fugue need to be balanced, and I understand, you know, exactly the relationship of this voice to that one. And yes, I can play it, but I want to go in and adjust these things in the recording studio, and that's my new medium. Recording is the future. That's funny. So Gould and Beatles did that the same year. And I think what stuck with me at that point was, wow, I love this music, and I totally get it. And here's Gould doing it for Bach, and the Beatles doing it with their music, but they're not performing anymore. And I love performing. You know, I think that one of the things about music is that it's supposed to be spontaneous. It's supposed to be real human beings bouncing off each other, whether it's from the stage to the audience or jamming with friends. I mean, I love the idea, you know, it's important as a composer to be able to sit in silence and imagine these complex musical worlds in your head, but it's also a wonderful experience to touch your music and to, you know, to hear it and hear it in the room with you, and to say, like, you know, you can't have an entire orchestra there, but you'd kind of like to have the orchestra there. You'd like musicians playing for you, and you'd like to say, oh, you know what? Duh, I need 10 more French horns, or, you know, that just doesn't work right. I need some instrument that doesn't exist. You want to go back and forth between the sound and touching it. So I think from that very early time, age 13, 14, 15, I thought, yes, this rich studio-produced music is the future, but it can't be the future to go run away into the recording studio. You know, how can we take that kind of complexity and richness and make it possible for people to touch it and play it live? That's what Hyperinstruments are. So it took a while for, I think the seed was planted when I was a teenager, and it was really, it took me until I got out of Juilliard. At Juilliard, I was just learning to be a composer, but I was also learning how to manipulate computers. So nobody at Juilliard, this is kind of in the mid to late 70s, nobody was interested in computers then. It was kind of too late for Moog synthesizers, and there were a few computers around the world in like Stanford University and MIT and Princeton, or Columbia University, about the only ones, where you could, you know, you used punch cards, and you'd go in and type out your computer program to make notes appear. And I mean, this is what I learned how to do when I was at Juilliard. I found somebody at Columbia who taught me how to do this. I'd go to the City University Graduate Center here in Manhattan, type out the punch cards for maybe 30 seconds of music that I wanted to, let's say, play for a string quartet that looked at my music and thought it was completely crazy and unplayable. And I said, no, it sounds really good. I'm going to put it on, you know. So you made the punch cards. A week later, I'd go back and pick up a reel-to-reel tape, and you'd put it on the tape recorder. And of course, you couldn't edit it. You couldn't see the notation. It was ridiculous. But I learned that at Juilliard. And then when I went to Paris in 1978, this IRCAM Institute had just opened up at the Pompidou Center. And for the first time, there was really money around and people around to think about really bringing musicians and scientists and technologists together. It was like, I was very lucky to be there at that time. It was really great. And they were just starting to invent computers that worked fast enough to give you music immediately. So instead of waiting a week to get your music back, you still had to write software. There was no graphics, but you'd write some software, say, okay, now, and it would play your piece, and then you might be able to do a carriage return. It would make it louder or softer. It was very primitive, but it was immediate. And that's when I started thinking about these hyperinstruments. You know, wow, you could have the best of both worlds. You could have layer upon layer and delicate sound and voices and instruments and sounds nobody have ever heard. You can mix them all together, but I can put them in a laboratory. I can put them in a studio so that they'll play back immediately. And if I can touch a key and have something happen, I should be able to make my own instrument. I should be able to make something where I can squeeze something, or you know, the way I touch something should be able to change the sound. So I started thinking about either leveraging off of existing instruments or making new instruments that would take what people do well in mastering an instrument, but multiplying the effect that you could produce with that instrument. So I didn't actually build a hyperinstrument until I moved to MIT in 1985, because at that point personal computers had just come out, so you could do all kinds of things with a, you know, $2,000 box. Anyway, there were a lot of things that happened in the mid-'80s that all of a sudden made it possible to do a lot of very quick interactive music. And with the hyperinstrument, the idea was how to take the act of performing, how to measure what a performer is playing, but also how they're playing, what the interpretation is, and let that interpretation be the equivalent of 5 recording engineers in the Beatles' digital recording studio, instead of a bunch of people moving knobs up and down and pushing buttons to change that effect and saying, oh, let's add that. You simply do it by playing your instrument. And if you play the downbeat of a certain measure louder, or if I play this phrase, building up the intensity to this section, or if I lay off and it all becomes very calm. If I change, I'm all showing as if I'm playing the cello, but the cello is not a bad way of thinking about it, because you can change all kinds of qualitative aspects of the sound. If I'm playing a note and it goes from ooh, if I change that kind of quality of sound, I started to measure those kind of things, so that that sound might mean, okay, if I make that transition, then I want to change the cello. It's not a cello anymore. It's a voice, or it's something I've never heard before. Or if I use this part of the bow and play with certain accents, I'm going to play a melody in, and depending on the way I play, it's going to add its own harmony. So the instrument, a single person playing an instrument could make the equivalent of a multi-track recording. And by interpreting the music differently in as natural a way as possible, I could shape the way this sounded, not like being at a mixing desk in a recording studio, not like writing a computer program, not like working with a machine, but just like playing naturally. So that's what I wanted a hyperinstrument to be, especially for trained musicians. So one of the interesting things about inventing these instruments, and actually in some ways, the more unusual the instruments are that you think of, or the sounds you think of, the more radical the technology is that you're trying to develop for music in particular, the more likely it is that something unexpected is going to come out of it that you didn't expect at the beginning. So it's a perfect case. We built this hypercello for Yo-Yo Ma, and you know, I wanted to keep it as close to a regular cello as possible, so had a regular fingerboard, regular strings. Yo-Yo's a really nice guy, but when I started talking about taping or nailing things onto a Stradivarius, he didn't like that idea too much. So we made a physical instrument from scratch, so we could put measurement devices and sensors right in the instrument. So you play this cello, you plug it in. It can sound like a regular cello, but it's also measuring everything that's happening. Then we took a regular bow, because measuring the bowing for cello is like breathing for a singer. So we had to measure everything about the horsehair on the string and the pressure and how fast it's moving and the angle. We found out the best way to do that was to put 2 computer chips on either side of the bow, to send electricity through the chips into the air, to put a little antenna on the cello. The antenna picks up the electricity, and it can tell, if you write software, which side of the bow the electricity is coming from. And by doing that, you can tell where the bow is, how fast it's moving, how much bow you're using, which part of the bow you're on, the angle, everything you need to have a kind of language of the gesture of bowing. So we did that. It worked well. I wrote some pieces for Yo-Yo. He played them. And so that kind of hypercello started taking off. At the same time, we were rehearsing, and we found that when Yo-Yo's bow got close to the cello, when his hand got close to the cello, the measurement went all wacky. It wasn't supposed to do that. So we went back to the lab, and we found out that sure enough, his body was absorbing electricity from this circuit, which is kind of a drag because, you know, it became unpredictable. So first we figured out how to modify it so you could predict it. But then I started thinking, oh, gee, if this electric circuit is measuring where, you know, how much electricity his hand is absorbing, it actually knows, I could tell where his hand is. And if I could do that, I could actually throw away the cello and throw away the bow and just make an instrument that measures the way somebody moves their hands. And so a light bulb went off, and I started thinking, my gosh, all this sophisticated software for measuring how Yo-Yo plays and how he moves, and this technique of the bow, I should be able to use similar techniques for measuring the way anybody moves. And so somebody who's not a professional or trained musician, I should be able to make a musical environment for them. So the first instrument we made after the hypercello was a chair. We made something called the sensor chair. And we actually made this for the magicians Penn and Teller, because they were following the work, and we kind of had this idea. So we took a chair, put a piece of metal on the chair. When you sit on the chair, your rear end touches the metal, and your body becomes part of this electric circuit, just like the bow was. So electricity is streaming out of your body. You put 2 poles in front of the chair, and the poles have sensors in them with little lights. So when I move my arms, electricity is coming out of my arms, and these sensors can tell how much electricity is in the air. So again, if I write software, it knows exactly where my hands are. And it also, if I'm smart enough, I can write software, it knows, am I moving in a jagged way? Am I moving smoothly? Am I moving continuously? Am I moving discontinuously? So there are all kinds of qualities I can pick up. So we made actually a musical instrument and then a little opera magic trick for Penn and Teller, which was based on sitting on this chair and playing melodies and harmonies and rhythms just by moving your hands. And it was great. I sort of thought of it as a virtuosic instrument for anybody. I mean, everybody can move their hands, but you kind of have to sit down, learn where the sounds are, learn how to shape them, learn how to communicate this to somebody. So it was a real breakthrough. And we started making a lot of instruments for the general public. We did a big project at Lincoln Center for the Lincoln Center Festival called the Brain Opera, where we made a whole orchestra of about 75 instruments, about 10 different models. We called it the Mind Forest. We filled up the lobby of the Juilliard Theater. And people would come in. You'd be surrounded with this web of instruments, like a driving game where you could drive musical notes through pathways. Depending on how you drove, the music would change. Tabletops where you could move your fingers and change the music. Big walls where you could move your whole body, same electricity system, to change big masses of sound, percussion instruments that looked like these rubber organic pads, hundreds of them all over the room. So the audience got to experiment with these, and we put on a performance every hour of the brain opera, but half of it was prepared by me ahead of time. Half of it we took from what the audience had just done with these instruments. So it was a collaboration through these instruments with the audience. And around that time, I had a lot of really interesting students in my group. A lot of them have gone on to do really, really interesting things in all these kinds of areas, how to make music accessible to the general public. A couple of these students started a company right near MIT. It's still there. The company's called Harmonix, and they started, taking these same, especially this idea of a driving game where I could drive a musical note through a series of roads. They actually took some joysticks and had a piece of music that would play, and depending on how you moved, if you moved the right joystick, it would push this music to different harmonies. If you moved the left joystick, it would make the rhythm more complex. So just by moving the joysticks, anybody could modify this music. And they did work like that for about 7 or 8 years. They made some games that were kind of okay. I mean, they were actually very good games. They didn't sell all that much. And then somebody came to them and said, "Do you ever think of using, making a plastic guitar? And what would it be like if you took exactly the same software and had somebody with a guitar interface instead of these joysticks?" So we all talked about that. They made this game called Guitar Hero, and nobody expected it to be a success. And actually, when Guitar Hero first came out, the big, like Best Buy and Target and all those places bought very few of them. But the fact that it was a guitar interface and not joysticks, so many people had imagined what it would feel like to play guitar. And the gameplay, the idea that it wasn't just moving music around with joysticks, but you were being graded at how accurate you were, and it was very easy to tell how well you were doing. As we know, it became a success very fast. So, so that came directly out of the work on the bow and the cello, and that turning into this sensor chair, and all that software went into Harmonix, and is now out there as Guitar Hero and Rock Band. Yeah, so I never liked opera growing up. I always liked chamber music or solo music, even more than orchestral music. But as I started writing my own music, I kept getting attracted to words, and especially to, we talked before, I think, about these imaginary worlds that non-word music creates. You're somehow following a story. It's somehow important humanly if it's good music, but I fill in the details myself. And I started realizing that one of the great things about opera is that if you make the right kind of story, you can still have this kind of abstract, subliminal quality of music to take you on a journey, but you can root it just enough in a particular situation, a particular, kind of real situation that a person might have, or a particular context in the real world. If it's done in the wrong way, it kind of, I think, puts a straitjacket on music, and a lot of the power music has to really take us somewhere unexpected can go away. But if you do it in the right way, the music's subliminal power stays, and it connects to your own life and to real situations more closely. So I've done a lot of operas. I've probably done more different kinds of operas than anybody, because I've been trying to explore this form and see how to get the most out of it. The brain opera, where the public helps to create it. I did science fiction opera for the Pompidou Center in Paris, this magic opera with Penn and Teller. The one I'm working on now is called Death and the Powers, and it has an original story and libretto by Robert Pinsky, the great poet. And actually, one of my original images for this opera was, I'm so tired. In some ways, technology's wonderful. I love working with technology because it allows me to follow my imagination and to invent new things. But a lot of the feeling of technology, what things sound like when they come through loudspeakers, what it looks like when you go to a rock concert and you see a giant screen with Bono's nose, and then, on stage U2's about this big. And so I think in many ways the texture of technology actually diminishes human beings. It doesn't augment them. So I started thinking, well, how could we take this kind of hyperinstrument idea of measuring the way humans perform, the way they behave, the way they sing, the way they move, making that larger and more, and growing it through the performance. But so the final result wouldn't be coming out of loudspeakers and wouldn't be just video screens, but could actually be physical things. Could we make it so that if I move my hand here, there's some strings that start vibrating, or there's wind that blows through some objects, or they're percussive, multiple percussive objects that either make a sound like that or maybe much more delicate sounds. So, and visually as well, could we do something where flying objects and morphing forms, real physical ones, combined with the music, help to tell a story, even if there are no words. So I contacted Robert Pinsky, this poet, to say, you want to work on a crazy project like that? Can we make a stage, tell the story? And before we had a story, I was thinking about that. And then we made up a story, which turned out to literally be it's about a guy who's in his late 60s, rich, powerful, successful, slightly creepy, kind of like Bill Gates meets Bill Gates meets Howard Hughes meets Walt Disney, somebody like that. And he's obsessed not so much with staying alive forever. In fact, he actually wants to leave the world, and he imagines a kind of better, higher level of existence. So he wants to go, but he wants everything about himself, his memories, the texture of his life, his ability to still be in touch with the people he loves, his ability to manipulate, his business partners or whatever. He wants that to stay. So he uses his money and his smarts and his power to invent this thing called the system, which basically allows himself, he basically can download himself into his environment. So in the first scene, he's just finishing this system, and his wife and his daughter and his assistants are saying, yep, it's almost ready, but are you still going to be, is it going to be you? Where are you going to go? Don't leave. What is this? And he turns on the system at the end of the first scene, says, see you later, and transmigrates. He goes somewhere. And little by little, the stage comes alive. So the stage is like a big robot. And his whole room, which is made up of bookcases and furniture and objects and a gigantic chandelier, which looks like a chandelier, these all turn into him, and they start to move, and they start to vibrate, and they start to make sound. And they don't literally look like him, and they don't literally necessarily sound like him, although he does talk and sing through them in a modified form. This becomes the future of his existence, and everybody who's left has to decide, is this really him? Is that you, Dad? Is that you, Simon? They have to decide if they like this. I mean, he's left himself, he's left his legacy. This is what he wants to leave in the world. Do they want this stuff? Do they want to live with this Simon left behind? And then they have to decide if this existence, he actually wants them all to follow him. So they have to decide whether what we know of his human existence is good enough. Should we stay here, or is this really a promise of something better? And that's where the tension of the opera comes. So it's a very unusual one. We have this set that makes music and comes alive and moves and interacts with characters. It's quite large. We're building it all from scratch at the MIT Media Lab. We have live performers on stage as well. We have a chorus of robots. They're 12 robots, 7 feet tall. They actually are 3.5 feet that extend to 7 feet. They comment on the action. They're actually slightly futuristic. They're also being designed by this research assistant. They're kind of a bridge between now and the future. And they're a little bit mechanical. They glide around. They don't really understand what's going on because they're robots. So death and, Simon somewhere else, love. What is this stuff? Why would you care about this? And then my favorite characters, I think, are the furniture. Because I wanted very unexpected parts of the set to not exactly be human, but be able to reach out to humans. So the chairs and the tables and the sofa all have legs that walk around and they glide around, and they're not as well developed as what we call the opera bots, the elegant 7-foot ones. They're kind of strange, and they're lurching, and they're trying to be as elegant as humans. They're trying to imitate their voices, so they learn how to talk. And it's just a very strange world, and it's a tug of war between the limit between a human being and what a very sophisticated technology can represent about yourself. So it's a reflection about mortality and what you can leave behind and what you can pass on to others. And I think it's a reflection about being human. Strangely, some of the most human characters, it's one of my themes generally, I think some of the technology, especially these furniture robots, are more emotional and more real, more human, certainly than you'd ever expect technology to be, but than some of the humans. We're at a very, very interesting, exciting, and a little bit scary point in music technology. I mean, over my career, let's say the last 25 years, we've gone from these music and computers being for 10 people in the world, to having personal computers, to now being able to do amazing things on your iPhone or with Rock Band. So right now there's an enormous capability with technology in our devices that everybody has access to. The one obvious thing is that the devices are so good now that you can also see their limitations extremely well. So there are a lot of music apps on the iPhone, for instance. There's an ocarina, there's some music instruments you can play. There's some rhythm instruments. There's some editing instruments. And it's like the dog that can talk. It's like, I have a dog that can talk. Oh, gee, but I can't understand, I can only understand 1 or 2 words that he's saying. But it's a dog. I mean, it's pretty good. So an iPhone doing what it can do with music is kind of remarkable, but it's very crude. The sound isn't that refined. I mean, I've got one in my pocket. It doesn't feel like a music instrument. It's it's hard, it's fragile. You can't squeeze it, you can't touch it. It's even much more it's fine for most of the things you do with multimedia, but even think of a piano. I mean, a piano's a machine, but you've got ivory and there's weight behind the keys, and you have this, you feel the resonance in the instrument, you feel the vibration in the pedal. I mean, these are still very crude. So I think one thing that will happen is that the kind of merger of hyperinstruments, of instruments that have a real physical feel, that are sensitive, that are worthy of somebody learning and mastering, will be combined with, there's a lot of computing and software power already in these little devices. So I think we'll start seeing real instruments and composing technology that is available to many people that's just a lot more sophisticated than this. I think we'll see something like Rock Band and Guitar Hero, which right now is a huge amount of fun, but it doesn't really teach you about music. It doesn't really help you listen. Even if you're playing with 4 or 5 people, you're glued to the screen, making sure you're following the visual symbols. It doesn't teach you about personalizing your performance. So, it doesn't rate you on, is your performance more beautiful? Is it more, there are no adjectives involved. So I think that's another frontier. Certainly we'll see pretty soon things like music games that are also creative and expressive and worthy of learning. But I think the big breakthroughs really have to do with our growing understanding of what goes on in our minds and why is it that music affects us at all. I mean, it's still a pretty big mystery that music exists in every culture, every society that we know about, but it's very hard to trace back why that would be. What are the biological reasons? What are the social reasons? Why does every society seem to want to make music when it often seems like, kind of a frill? Well, it's not a frill. And, we probably don't have time to talk about why. I'll come back. We can talk about that again some other time. But music seems to stimulate more parts of our mind than almost any other activity. It combines more parts of our minds. It synchronizes our minds. It allows people in groups to do a nonverbal immediate activity together. You could argue that it synchronizes people's biological, many biological functions for individuals when you're part of a group making music together. There are many reasons that music exists, and we're beginning to not only understand that, but measure that. So one thing that I think we'll see, we're already starting to see people being interested in it, but this is something, yeah, I think in the next 20 years, we'll start seeing enough knowledge developing that we'll be able to have some objective ways of measuring whether a particular piece of music is pleasing to you, whether if you're in a particular mood and you want to keep that mood or be in another mood, whether by listening to this particular piece of music or by changing that music while you're listening, whether we can reinforce something, pull you somewhere else. You could think of it, you know, in some ways you could think of it like a perfect psychoanalysis session or like a yoga session, except the music is a medium to lead you somewhere or reinforce something. It's really being used as a more precise instrument than we can possibly do now, not just guessing, but really measuring the effect it has on you, both to select it and to play it and to modify it. I think we're going to start seeing a variety of music environments rather soon and developing over the next 25 years. So music that adapts to what you need at a particular moment. I think over the next 25 to 50 years, let me put it this way. All music right now, when there's a hit, the reason it's a hit is that a composer and a performer have identified some common quality in that music, something about it, something about the way that particular melody falls, that a very large number of people are all going to find attractive. I mean, that's the definition of popularity. Something that literally resonates with many, many people. So all the music we know that's popular is actually commonly shared music that takes things that are similar about all of us. But if you take the idea that we're going to be able to measure more and more your particular mental structures, your particular reactions to a piece of music, your particular needs at a particular moment, so I can select music for you, watch you while you're listening and fine-tune the music, you can imagine completely the opposite thing happening, which is that perhaps 25 to 50 years from now, I can design a piece of music not so that it appeals to something common in millions of people, but I can design the music so that it's exactly right for you and only you at this particular moment.